I'd like to welcome you all to the Mashreq Energy Webinar. We're here today to discuss the topic of unity with carbon pricing, hosted by Mashreq and hosted by Badar Chaudhry, head of the energy sector at Mashreq Bank. I'm delighted to have joining us today to shed some light and update us on the progress of carbon pricing globally, but particularly with a zero sort of lens on the Middle East. Mr. Gordon Bennett, who is Managing Director of Utility Markets at the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, which has taken on a leadership role in the UAE to expand the carbon pricing market. And Mr. Curran, Head of Environmental Products at Vitol, who was brought into the region actually by Vitol to establish a carbon trading desk, and we look forward to sort of hearing from him on how that is going in terms of the progress within the region on that front. So I'm delighted to invite everybody. For the next half an hour, we'll be chatting about this topic, and I would like now to hand the floor to Badar to open the session for us.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to have you join in this webinar. One of the most hot topics these days of great interest, and we are extremely delighted to have on the panel two global experts with global insights on the subject matter. From the generic perspective, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, we are witnessing accelerated commitment by Middle East countries and private sector companies towards the climate change, and in order to meet their stated national net zero targets. And in that regards, carbon credits is one of the tools in the arsenal that is being actively advocated to achieve those objectives. Carbon credits effectively can help to reduce the emissions and promote the development of clean energy. What is important is to understand what the offering is. Carbon credits are, in fact, tradable units that represent the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. They are used by companies to offset their emissions, or they can be used to fund projects that reduce emissions. So effectively, as with tools that are available in the market for different solutions, carbon credits is one of those solutions which is being advocated as an accelerator in achieving the overall objectives of under the 2015 Paris Accord. It is important to highlight that the importance of developing the platform in the Middle East is something that we are expecting a key functionaries to take lead on, which effectively will be the regulators, wherein there are three considerations which are important. One is the devising of standards for climate reporting and disclosure, which effectively will be a tool or mechanism to monitor the carbon emissions. The next step, of course, is the creation of carbon pricing framework, which effectively will be the mechanism to how to price the carbon. And the last one, of course, is establishing the carbon credits or carbon markets. These three important steps are what we today will hopefully hear from our panelists to understand where the market is heading towards in this regards, what they see in the global domain, and what is their view with respect to this particular space in the regional markets. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Badar. I'd like to now invite Gordon Bennett from ICE to give us a few introductory remarks as well.
Hi there. Thank you and good morning. I'll start with who is ICE because I won't assume that you know who ICE is. Our most well-known brand name is the New York Stock Exchange. We own it, but the ICE brand is synonymous with our energy and environmental markets. We are the largest energy and environmental market in the world, and as earlier said, through our IFAD, ICE Futures Abu Dhabi, we also have a presence in the region, which is great. I am managing director of utility markets. What does that mean? Well, the origins of utility markets is the economics of electricity generation. So, i.e., the portfolio is coal, gas, and electricity, and importantly, because the UK, Europe, and certain states in the US, electricity generators pay for their pollution. I'm also the head of environmental markets. So it's not obvious from the title, but I'm the global head of environmental markets. And having watched the electricity generation sector decarbonize, I've really had a front row seat in the power of carbon pricing. So I do have a couple of slides. Carbon pricing, difficult topic to cover in 5 minutes. I don't know if the first slide can be brought up. The next slide, please. So the problem statement, why would unity with carbon pricing be a good thing? The problem statement is that the atmosphere is finite at a set temperature target, and you can use economics to solve for that. If you take the next slide, we can go into what the market failures are. People are committing to net zero to effectively solve for the finite carbon budget. The carbon budget is used is the sum of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that's predominantly an energy transition, but it's also carbon sinks. And the market failure is we do not pay to utilize the atmosphere when we consume joules, and we don't put a value on carbon sinks, and hence the carbon budget is getting smaller and smaller. So you can't change the science, so you need to change the economics if you want to address those failures. And the way to change the economics is through pricing. Carbon, it prices the negative externality of pollution, either through a carbon allowance or a credit, or it can attribute a value to carbon sinks through carbon removals, and that would come in the form of a carbon credit. Now, as far as the overall market in terms of carbon pricing, the recent World Bank report said around 25% of the world's emissions are priced either through carbon trading mechanisms, cap and trade, crediting mechanisms, or through taxes. However, most of those are not at a value that would actually incentivize behavior change. So whilst there's a quarter covered, most of those are not being priced at the appropriate level to solve for the problem. And then quickly, in terms of the region, there's an active consultation in terms of a cap and trade program in the UAE being led by the Environment Agency, and we've been contributing to that. That would generate carbon allowances and allow pollution to be priced. There's clearly some interesting technology development in the region. When I was in Dubai a few weeks ago, there was a company called Vesta, and there's also a company called 4401 focusing on mineralization. So that's carbon capture. Clearly, in order to realize those investments, a carbon credit market needs to be developed. So it'll be interesting to see how those evolve. And clearly, the region is the host of COP28. Led by His Excellency Dr. Sultan, and I think it's a great opportunity. Dr. Sultan clearly is the head of, I guess, the head of two energy companies, and because net zero is primarily an energy transition, I think it's a really great opportunity to lead from the front in practical terms how we can decarbonize the energy sector. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Michael, over to you. Michael Curran from Vitol for a few brief introductory comments, and then we'll go to our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to put up the first slide, please? In the meantime, well, thank you very much for the invitation. As Gordon did, I think people might know who Vitol are, but for those who don't, we are the largest private energy trader in the world, and we trade all the products. What, for those who do know us, might not know as well, is we are also very active in all things renewable energy, carbon trading, etc. And I've been, I think as Aleda was alluding to, I actually joined Vitol 17 years ago to set up the carbon desk, and we as Vitol never stopped developing projects for carbon and all the other elements, but effectively 3 to 4 years ago, we really rebooted the activity, and now we have people in all our main trading offices, Houston, London, Geneva, where I'm based, and Singapore, and we even have a gentleman, Badar, in our Bahrain office who are dedicated to carbon trading and all things to do with the opportunities around carbon and transition more generally. If you could go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to show a map, and Gordon was flagging the point that we are now in a situation where on a worldwide basis, even though it only covers 25%, you are seeing, and you know, as all good traders should do, you should spot the trend. It's very clear that the trend is towards prices or some form of pricing being put on carbon. Now, whether that's through a tax, cap and trade, emissions trading scheme, project-based or non-project based, is to be debated. But I think everybody on this call should assume now that, you know, the horse has effectively bolted, and that there will be, in the region that you guys are in, you will be exposed to some form of carbon pricing. The days of being able to export, you know, look at what Europe's doing in terms of creating an import tax for carbon. China will do the same thing. The US will probably do the same thing. The major blocks will determine that whether you have a domestic carbon pricing, they themselves will impose it upon you, almost in terms of a protectionist mechanism. So I think that's one message to get out there. And you will notice on this map that for the moment, the Gulf and the region doesn't actually have explicitly these objectives. Now, clearly that's already in the works. And I think you've seen some very interesting things. I was down in Nairobi a couple of weeks back for the PIF, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund tender. And we supplied into that tender, and then they turned around and supplied 13 of their domestic companies through the auction, so Aramco, etc. And I think it was a great success, and I think it's very impressive to see, you know, at different levels. And Gordon was referring to COP and what's coming there. I think we're going to see in the next second half of this year a real acceleration in the activity in the Gulf region, particularly driven, I suspect, by the UAE and what's happening at COP, and also by Saudi Arabia. I think the other thing to reflect on for everybody on this call is, whilst there will be carbon pricing, there won't necessarily be just one carbon price. So if you look around the world, if you look at Europe, for example, the emissions trading scheme we have there, you have an 85 euro, roughly somewhere to 80 to 95 euro price per ton of carbon. You go down to New Zealand, it had got up as high as 70, 80 New Zealand dollars. It's now back down to about 35, $40. Australia's in that 35-ish dollar. So you have lots of different pricing. There isn't one carbon pricing. And in the voluntary markets, carbon can be as cheap as $1, and it can be as expensive for, you know, very exotic biochar credit, even in the voluntary market at $300 a ton. So I think the other thing to be aware of is not all carbon is equal, not all carbon credits are equal, and not all carbon markets impose the same pricing mechanism. Next slide, please. So again, just to flag particularly for the region where I think the two main drivers will come from, if you look at the scale of what to meet the Paris obligations, the UAE and in particular Saudi Arabia will have to do, you can see the volumes are gargantuan. And therefore, what does that mean? It means that if you are to achieve those targets, probably a couple of things have to happen. There has to be a dramatic change in the technology that's applied to dealing with carbon capture and storage and other forms of removal and abatement in the region. But it also probably means that there's going to be an importation of carbon credits from other countries. So I had been advised to keep it very light, but I appreciate that some of the things in the carbon markets are a little bit esoteric, but we have, as I said, COP 28 coming up. And what you will see at COP is a very technical element around how do you account for the transfer of effectively pollution rights or emission rights between one sovereign and another sovereign, and working with private companies, so public-private partnerships. How do you work between those activities to make sure that ultimately you want to achieve these objectives at the lowest marginal cost, and an international trading mechanism for that is, I think, very important. And I'll just finalize on saying something coming back on this public-private partnership, just as an example for the group and where I think ultimately these markets are going. We have done, as Vitol, a joint venture with the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund to develop projects, carbon removal and carbon abatement projects in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa. That company is now called Carbon Vista, and Carbon Vista has signed an MOU with PIF to work with PIF to develop projects, to support projects that will help Saudi Arabia achieve its targets. All of these microcosm elements will start to create the ecosystem for carbon trading, carbon activity, and carbon pricing in the region. So I'll leave it there because I appreciate we want to have a decent Q&A as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael and Gordon, for those lot of points that all the points really you touched on. We want to sort of just expand a bit and get a bit more of your thoughts on that. Michael, I'll just go straight back to you as you just presented with a few pointers there. You mentioned, I mean, I wanted to sort of zero in the Middle East a bit later, but let's talk about the region first, maybe, and then we'll talk about bigger picture global. I mean, you mentioned a couple of things there, that globally there isn't a perfect carbon price for every country or every region. We have to accept that we're going to have different carbon prices. But so where does that put us, if you like, in terms of equality, equality across borders? Is that a solution to have different prices, or is it a problem in a sense? And can different prices work in tandem?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it's necessarily a problem. And I think Gordon referred to it. Ultimately, the regulators have to set the standard. So for argument's sake, if the regulator in country X says that we accept these specifications for carbon credits, A, B, C, D, E, well then, if you can meet those, there's a price for meeting those criteria. If another country says, well, no, for us, it has to meet another 15 criteria, well, you will assume that the tighter the specification, like any commodity, the higher the quality, the higher the specification, the rarer the actual underlying product is, or the more expensive it is to produce, you end up with a different price. So I think the commodity markets, and for the benefit of everybody, and this is a debate, is it more like a bond, is it more like a commodity? Coming from the commodity background, for me, carbon is more like a commodity. I think the commodity markets and the financial markets and the investment markets are very, very used to navigating once the rules have been set. So I would expect to see a flurry of activity or an increased activity once these rules are set. And the fact that that will lead to price differentiation is fine, I think, for the markets.
Okay, great. I mean, Gordon, on that point, there is differentiation already, and we saw on the map that Michael presented, different countries, different regions making different points of progress on this front. Developing markets in general are behind, perhaps for obvious reasons. Do you think that's a problem in the Middle East and the GCC? We saw on the map, yes, there's initiatives taking place in the UAE in particular, but how? Again, I don't want to use the word problem too often in this conversation, but we are here to find answers. That disparity, is that an issue, especially when it comes to, for example, different schemes across borders, perhaps putting emerging countries and economies at a huge disadvantage, depending on where they are on that front?
Well, I mean, it is a bit of a problem given the time on our hands. I think that one of the challenges is outside of countries, there's this is an abatement hierarchy being the narrative, whether it's SBTI, OECD, there's a whole host of organizations that talk about the abatement hierarchy of abate first, offset as a last resort, the hard stuff. I mean, there's 40 gigatons a year, and there have been 40 gigatons a year since 2015. So I'd say a lot of it is hard. You know, rewiring the way that we consume energy is hard. And what that hierarchy does, it means that people are not compensating. And if you're not compensating, you're not paying to pollute. If you're not paying to pollute, you're not addressing the market failure. So that's not really a country specific item. You know, in terms of developing nations, I think it's a great question, because carbon is a stock pollutant, and therefore it's the inventory over time is the important number, and certain countries have been responsible for the stock, and so for developing countries who, you know, some countries, particularly in Africa, are trying to solve for energy poverty whilst having to deal with a climate problem. So that's challenging, but I think that is what Article 6 and CDM was there for. It was to channel climate finance to global south. So if we can get a well-functioning carbon credit market again, then the developing countries, you know, are effectively going to get, or should get, payment to reduce. I mean, in a developed country like the UK or Europe, companies are paying to pollute. But from a developing country point of view, I think it's valid that countries are getting paid to reduce their pollution rather than having to pay to pollute, and so they're generating income rather than paying a cost. And the point on different carbon prices, I think Mike hit the nail on the head. There's different costs of production of a reduction or removal, so there should be different prices. In the same way, there's different prices to generate electricity, whether it's gas or coal or oil or renewables. So I don't see a problem with different pricing for carbon savings, reductions or removals. And in fact, if the market is going to solve for it, it should be cheapest to deliver, and the atmosphere is agnostic to where the reductions and removals come from. So if we can reduce a gigaton by, you know, deploying clean cooking in Africa at $7, then that's a good outcome, both for the market, for consumers, for countries, and ultimately, importantly, for the atmosphere.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Badar, if I can just go to you and just talk a bit about, just bring in the finance angle for a minute. It's really, you know, it's all about complementary tracks, isn't it? Because we've got the regulation, as Michael was saying, in terms of country by country region. As long as the regulators are controlling and defining, then it should work. From a sustainable finance sort of track point of view, to have this sort of ecosystem of that really taking off more and more in this region, is it the chicken or the egg in a sense? You know, do you think we need better, clearer policies by the governments in this region to reduce emissions, to regulate, subsidizing clean energy, etc., which will in turn obviously attract more finance, more banking interest into those projects? Is that the track, or you know, or do we set a carbon price to trigger, if you like, you know, more favorable policies? Where are we with that?
Sure. So, you know, as Michael sort of mentioned, we see this carbon credits as a commodity, and in order for a commodity to behave in the manner of typical commodity, is that it needs to have what we call as a liquidity profile, and that sort of essence is driven by the two key considerations. One is that you need the policy framework. It's extremely important that the policy framework sort of supplements and supports the establishment of the carbon credits, which will allow for the liquidity to be attracted towards such a new commodity, right? Clearly, there is no perfect carbon price. As with other commodities, there is no one price. You will always have a price by one competitor or one producer will probably have different inputs, and accordingly will be attracting a different price or a higher price. What the aim is that there's the burden of the carbon price should be distributed fairly. It should not be disproportionate, and the objective would eventually be that effectively what you are trying to achieve is to have to reduce emissions, right? Now, for developing countries or for markets where where the strategy is still being developed, they effectively can have a two-pronged strategy. One is that they commit towards technology and investments that help reduce the carbon footprint, and the other one is to develop the policy framework to benefit with the tradability of carbon credits. As mentioned by my colleagues, um, the carbon commodity has to be exportable or tradable between markets, between countries, between jurisdictions, and that is where it will be most effective.
Okay, thanks, Badar. And I mean, as I said, the chicken or the egg, again, if we get a more liquid carbon credit market here in the Middle East, that should presumably attract investment, into clean energy projects. I mean, I think it's a two-way direction, or two-way street, if you like, a win-win if those two can work in tandem. Michael, just back to you in terms of expectations, timelines. You said you've been obviously on this project of a carbon trading desk for years, but the focus has really been, revamped in the last few years, at least at Vitol. But from a regional perspective, how would you? Let's put a timeline on it. When do you expect, by definition, a liquid market for carbon trading here in the Middle East? And what would you say would be the top obstacle and the realistic obstacle to be overcome first on that front?
I think that's a tricky question, but I would say I'm more ambitious than maybe the rest of the market for the region in terms of its approach. Why do I say that? I say that because if you look at, again, there are expectations for COP and what will happen. I agree with Gordon. I think lots of people criticize the idea that you have an energy, effectively a major energy company holding the climate change conference, but actually it's completely logical. Where the solution isn't going to come from the people who don't emit, it's going to have to drive, and the solution is going to have to come from those who do emit. So for me, that's completely logical. Again, going back to the slide I showed on the second, the amount of demand in the region, if you include, so I put up the numbers for the UAE, Saudi, etc. But if you include Bahrain, Oman, etc., you are really ramping up. It's a real core element of the demand for the world. So what I think will happen, and I think if you look at some of the activities going on, it's creating a demand sink. What will be the element that actually enables people like the Vitols or other people to go out, develop projects, invest in carbon capture and storage, or nature-based solutions, or investing in the global south as we do in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America, etc. What would enable us to disperse, and I'm sure Mashreq included, a lot more capital, is if we knew that there was 1 billion tons of demand or 2 billion tons of demand. I can guarantee you, if there was a very clear demand signal, the money, millions, billions, probably trillions would be released into it. So I think probably what the region can do, and I think what they're looking to do, frankly, is work on structuring that they be a demand sink and they be a source of quality and they drive the specifications that they want. I think you see that in the UAE, and I think you see that with Saudi Arabia, PIF in particular, and that's what I expect to see. In terms of timing, as I said, I think it will accelerate enormously into COP at the end of this year. And I think, liquid market, is difficult to define, but I think we will see something quite different if we have this conversation again this time next year than as it looks now.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Gordon, in terms of individual companies, the corporate side of things, sort of playing into this initiative, we talked about governments, policies. Admittedly, there's probably more cooperation to be done across the region as well, but we see the different countries taking their initiatives, and we'll see progress there. Are companies understanding their carbon footprints enough to be able to plug in to this trading mechanism eventually, you know, or do you think there's still sort of a lack of clarity there, if you like, on the best way forward?
Is there a lack of? I personally, I don't think there should be a lack of clarity. Perhaps there is. I mean, the situation we find ourselves in with companies is that they would rather wear the reputational risk of not contributing a payment for their pollution than being, you know, paying for their pollution, some of their pollution, and being accused of greenwashing, which produces a terrible environmental outcome. And I could understand why that's the case, but I feel that the carbon credit market, or the voluntary market, as it's sometimes referred to, is almost being held to a risk profile that's unachievable. I.e., you can only participate if there's zero risk, and there's not a market or a thing in the world that has zero risk associated with it. So in the same way, if I were selling product and I have accounts receivables, I don't expect to get all of those paid, so I provide for them, right? If I sell a product, I have warranty provisions. So I struggle with the concept that this needs to be a zero risk market to participate. That's an impossible aspiration, and so I'd like to see more companies trying. I mean, and I think Mike's entirely right that we see the way this is going. Carbon pricing will come more into the everyday lives of companies and countries, and therefore, do you want to start sort of practicing risk management that now, or do you want to wait another X years? I think it's better for everyone if more corporates sort of have a try and then build some more demand, and then that will crystallize the liquidity. I mean, in order to build a liquid market, you need buyers and sellers, and from what I see, we don't see many buyers from our point of view. Clearly, Mike has a different view because he's further down the sort of the channel than we are. We're kind of more at the end of the life cycle of the market rather than the beginning.
Okay, and of course that word off-taker and so many different parts of the industry is so important, isn't it? To make the commitment, to make the investment, and in this case, it's no different. Mike, just back to you slightly on the same point, but not just from a company perspective, but sector perspective. So if we look at the different sectors you might want to plug into carbon market and carbon pricing, we have different instruments: the voluntary, cap and trade, internal carbon pricing. Do you think we have enough variety in the basket, if you like, for people to choose from? Does a particular sector or industry necessarily prefer one or the other?
In my experience, the most important thing is regulatory clarity. So whether it manifests itself, so I'll give you an example maybe, so which I think, as coming from the trading background, I would rather a trading mechanism to deal with this than a tax mechanism. But if you look at what South Africa has done, which, for the benefit of the audience, they have put in place a tax scheme which ramps up on an annual basis, and then they impose a reduction on everybody, or basically a payment to pollute. But they have given them the option that if they invest in a certain number of clean type projects in South Africa, they can hand in the credits that come from those projects against their obligation. So what does that do for South Africa? It brings in foreign direct investment. You create clarity. Okay, it's a tax. It's not a trading scheme, but it turns into a mechanism by which investors can come in and say, okay, fine, I'm willing to put money into this country to generate X million tons of carbon credits because I know the demand sink is there. And if I'm able to produce those at a discount to the tax scheme, I know that therefore there will be a market for them, and then I can arbitrage between my commodity, which I may then look to export if the value for that commodity goes above the tax scheme, but I know I have effectively a demand sink. And I think this is one of the key things, and Gordon referred to it from what he's seeing as well. I think we probably, as Gordon was saying, he's at the end of the line, so he might not see as much of the demand on that kind of B2B or OTC stuff that we see, obviously. But I think that the key thing is demand. The key thing is demand and regulatory clarity. I prefer emissions trading schemes. I don't think we have a lack of mechanisms. Cap and trade has been around for years. It's very well understood. It's very well worked in Europe, California, etc. So I think that the knowledge is there. It just needs to be implemented in a coherent way.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. We're running out of time very quickly on this. Badar, I want to go back to you with a question and perhaps also to give us a few of your concluding comments. But from the finance world perspective, from the banking perspective, we talked to you a little bit about whether you see that that we need more clarity from regulators. We need more action on clean energy initiatives by the government for the banks to be interested to finance. What would you say is the next sort of top priority for finance outfits and banks like yours to want to see, to support and to get more involved in these carbon pricing markets? Mashreq wants to become a leader in that space. What's stopping you now from doing that tomorrow? What would you say you'd want to see next?
Yeah, so I think fortunately, it sort of boils down to the same 2 points that has been mentioned by Michael. One is we need definitive, clear regulations, which effectively provide the bank the framework or the canvas to understand the markets or the product itself. It is like any other commodity, any other discipline of a business, be it trading, be it manufacturing. You need regulations to understand what are the sort of key regulations or rules around that. The other one is, of course, is demand, right? As with other commodities, as those commodities have matured over the years, we've seen, for example, first oil, then gas, LNG. Now there is drive. Then the solar energy or renewable energy. Similarly, soft commodities. Then you see a lot of discussions around ammonia, as hydrogen. The moment there is demand, right, you will see financial institutions chasing that demand as well. As Mashreq, we remain committed towards the energy. One, because it is the largest contributor to the regional GCC economies as a GDP contributor, but more importantly, the energy transition as well, right? And effectively, this is one of these tools which is a very quick plug and play. It mimics the role or the profile of a commodity. It is effectively, if it becomes a tradable instrument, there is demand, there's liquidity to price it and to arrange financing around it. And effectively, that is where we see, we believe that leading up to COP28, we expect that regulations will be thrashed out, will be put in place. And following the COP28, we expect to see a lot of activity coming in from participants. And we being partners to those participants, the likes of ENOC, the likes of Vitol, we will, by very nature of our relationship with them, extend our support to them to be actively trading in this space.
Badar Chaudhry from Mashreq Bank, thank you so much for hosting this. The two top words we picked up once they were regulation and demand. Security of demand is always very important, of course, and clarity on regulation, and the recognition that there will be variance in how each region or each country or each sector, for that matter, might use these mechanisms. But the idea is to get everybody to participate and contribute to the whole. But thank you so much to Michael Curran and Gordon Bennett also from joining us today for the webinar. And thank you to Mashreq Bank for that as well. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.